everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name's Meredith Phillips and today we're going to be chatting about revision. I said a few weeks back that I was going to try to do some kind of like revision video, like a sit down video. I don't do these as much as I used to, but this is that video. So here we go. Revising a huge 50,000 plus word manuscript is a big challenge. I've struggled for years with the revision process and mostly I've just gotten stuck. So I'm absolutely not trying to present myself as some kind of expert or someone who's done this super successfully like dozens of times. I really am not that person. I feel like I've successfully and completely revised one project and I'm in the middle of a second project at the moment. I've never published anything, so I'm very much coming at this as like a, here's what I've done, maybe it'll help. I have been writing for over 8 years now, and I do think I have learned some things. And I do know some things that work for me. I do know some things that don't work for me. And so that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. If you search how to revise a novel here on YouTube or probably just the internet at large, you're going to find a number of resources out there and a lot of them are very good. We have a bunch of other author tubers like Alexa Dunn, Shalin Writes, Michelle Schusterman, Abby Emmons. They've all covered this topic. I'm going to link their videos below. I would highly recommend checking them out. Shalin, I think, has like a whole playlist of revision related videos. Hers are great. I would very much recommend looking through all of those. I'm also going to link below to Susan Dennard's blog / Substack, whatever it is now. She did a big series of blog posts years ago where she goes into incredible detail about how exactly she revises her books. So I'll link that below as well if you've never looked at that. Some of the videos do cover like the same kind of advice, but I would still recommend watching them through because, you know, like sometimes you hear the same thing over and over again and you're like, I don't know, I still just like don't get it. It's just like, it's not clicking quite right. And then like one person comes along and they say the same thing, but just in a really particular way and it makes it click for you. You know, have you ever had that happen? So even though a lot of these videos have the same kind of information in them, watch them anyway because the person presenting the information might just phrase it in some kind of magical way where it like clicks in your brain. So the basic advice, the basic revision advice that you will find in these other videos, that you'll find on Susan Dennard's blog, that you'll find in various other places, in craft books and wherever else, the basic revision advice is to start with the big picture stuff, the big plot holes, the big character arcs, and work your way down to the smaller things like clunky dialogue or missing descriptions. That is excellent advice. I wholeheartedly agree with it. But if that's the big thing that you're looking at, it's not super specific either. Like when you talk about big picture stuff, like what is that? How do you identify it? So I'm going to try to get into a little more nitty gritty in this video for you. One thing I did really love in Michelle Schusterman's video that I linked below is that she said when you are revising, you are no longer a writer, you're an editor. Which I thought that's such a great way of approaching this. You have to be willing to cut entire scenes, really great dialogue, if it is not serving the story. You have to be able to look at the story objectively. You have to be open to new possibilities, new ways the story might be able to go that you haven't considered yet. And overall, you really have to make a choice in terms of revising stuff that's going to be best for the story. The sooner you're able to kind of bite that bullet and make those difficult decisions, I think the process will end up going a lot faster for you. So in this video, I'm going to split things into two parts. The first part here is going to be just like what I do personally. This is how I did stuff last year. This is how I'm doing stuff this year, how my revision process generally looks, what my different drafts look like. Then I'm going to try to dig a little bit deeper to pinpoint some specific big picture things that might be not quite right in your current project. Sometimes you might be rereading your work and feel like something's not quite right, but you're not really able to verbalize what exactly isn't working. So I'm going to try to give you some ideas of what might not be working in your project. So first things first, this is a video about revision, so we're not going to chat about outlining or first drafting. I've got a bunch of videos covering that kind of stuff on my channel. So I'm assuming that if you're ready to revise, you have a completed first draft. The first step in revision is to just put the first draft aside. Like, don't look at it. I just put it away. I feel like this is almost universal advice. I don't think I've ever seen somebody say, finish your first draft on this day, and then the very next day, like, jump into revisions. I don't think I've ever heard anyone recommend that. I feel like the only time I've heard someone doing something like that is if they're like a published author who is on a really tight deadline and they literally do not have the time or the luxury to put it aside for some amount of time. But most of us here, I think, are probably unpublished. We don't really have any kind of official deadlines for ourselves. So put it aside at least a week. Some people do more like a month. I personally like a month. That's oftentimes what I've done in the past, and I think that probably gets you the best results. Some people put it aside for months or even years. So you got to do what's right for you. Use the time away from it to maybe work on something else. But if you're only putting it aside for like a week or a month, like do something that's going to refill your creative well. Read some craft books, watch some movies, read books, something like that. Once I've had it take its little break and I'm well rested, I can pick it back up again, and the first thing I like to do is just reread the entire project from start to finish. If at all possible, I like to do this in one day because I feel like that gives me a really good general overview of the entire book. If you don't have the time to be able to, do 5 to 8 hours of reading your own stuff in one day, that's totally understandable. But try to read it in as short a time frame as possible, again, just so you have a really nice overview of the story. While I'm doing this initial reread, I do not take any kind of notes. I'm just reading, I'm just taking the story in. I'm not trying to think about the character arcs and is this working? I'll have thoughts like that, but I'm not thinking too hard about any of it. After I'm done with this reread, I might jot down a few notes in a Scrivener document about what I thought, sort of like a first impressions. Was there anything major that stood out to me that needed to be fixed? Did I notice a big plot hole? Were the characters kind of bland? Just sort of generally, what did I think of this thing? Sometimes I'm really not even too sure what is not right exactly. So some of my notes might be things like the ending felt weird, or this character didn't come out quite the way I wanted them to. I'm not trying to think of solutions at this point. I'm just noting something here isn't working. The things in this list could be really big picture things like plot holes, or it could be smaller stuff. I might notice this scene is really boring. This one scene here, it's real boring and nothing's happening in it. Or it could be a piece of really important information that I somehow left out. In this first draft of the project I'm currently working on, the heroine's emotional wound, her traumatic past event, you got half of it and you never find out the rest. You never do. I just didn't add that. So that was something we needed to add in this next draft. While you're working on this list of things, it can be, for me at least, it can be really easy to fall into the negatives or the constructive criticism kind of items. But you can also add positive things. If you're oh my gosh, I love how this scene turned out, or you really love one of the characters, you can gush a little bit too. Leave yourself some positive comments. That can be really nice to come back to later when you're reviewing everything, and instead of having this giant document of here are all the problems, here's all the dumb stuff you did in this first draft, you have other stuff in there too. You have all the positives. So this list isn't something I sit down and make in an hour. It usually I'm adding to it over the course of a couple days, maybe a week, something like that. After I'm done with this sort of general list, then I go into the manuscript again and I go through it scene by scene, and I take more detailed notes on every scene and what I think needs to be changed. I'll show you my Scrivener setup for this in a few minutes, but I'm just going to kind of give you my little overview here first. So my Scrivener notes on each scene could be a huge variety of things. They could be noting a lack of setting description. We all know me, I hate describing the setting, and describing characters. So usually that's missing, and so I'll note that kind of thing. It could be something where the way I wrote something, it didn't make things clear, it's a little vague, so I might note I need a little more information on something. I also sometimes just have questions do I need to add this kind of thing, or should I cut this part here? I'm not really trying to necessarily solve anything at this point. I'm just noting things that are off or things I know that need to be fixed in some way. As I get into later scenes in the book, I might realize, ooh, this character needed to be introduced way earlier, or this event is fun, but I didn't set it up at all. Like, it seems really random, or it seems too convenient, or it seems off somehow. I need more information in previous chapters. So I'm noting that kind of stuff too. So for example, if you have a scene in chapter 20 where your character is jumping from rooftop to rooftop in like a daring escape scene, that's really fun. But if your character in previous scenes has been kind of set up to be a little hesitant, maybe not much of a risk taker, then them jumping around on rooftops isn't going to make a whole lot of sense. So I might put a note like, fix their character stuff earlier. Once I'm finished with these scene by scene notes, I go through them again and I pull out those pieces where I'm like, you need to do this earlier, you need to do this sooner, whatever. So if in chapter 20, my character is jumping around on the roofs, I need to go back to maybe chapter 5 or chapter 10 or something like that to sprinkle in information that, hey, this character is a little bit of a risk taker. I need to show them being bold, maybe earlier, or athletic in some manner, earlier in the story, so that when they're jumping around on the roofs, it makes sense for that character. So I'll go back through the manuscript and I'll try to find places where it would make sense to show the character being reckless. You probably need a couple different scenes at least to show that character trait. And so I'll just put a note in those chapters where I'm like, this could fit here, maybe, I don't know. I'll put it in a bunch of different scenes, so I have that in my head of like, hey, you better establish this earlier so it makes sense later on. Once I'm done with all of my note taking and the organizing and all of that stuff, I dive into actually changing the manuscript. I did things a little different this time. Last year, I just went into chapter 1 and started changing stuff. This year, what I did is I went back to my outline and I actually updated the outline first to fit in, like, where is this information going to go? What am I going to cut? What am I going to add? I find it oftentimes a lot easier to deal with like the couple thousand words of an outline versus like 50 some thousand words of a first draft. It's so much easier to scroll through an outline than it is to scroll through 300 pages. So what I did in my current outline is I used the strike through tool feature, whatever. I did a strike through of stuff where I was like, you're cutting this. And then I added text and highlighted it to indicate like, this is new stuff you got to add to this scene. So once I've got the outline updated, I know how each scene needs to be altered. I've got my individual notes on a scene by scene level. I go into each scene and I've got those two things. It's like directions. I've given myself directions. Hey, in this scene, you need to add setting description. You need to add character description. You need to mention this character trait earlier. You need to, or hopefully show it earlier. You know, I have all that stuff, and then you can go in and figure out, okay, where should I add character description? Where should I add, you know, showing this athletic trait that'll come into play later on? And you can fiddle with how to add it in. I go through each scene probably a dozen times. I read these scenes so many times trying to figure out like, okay, where's this gonna go? After I've gone through it once, I read through it again, and I go back through and I'm fiddling with the words and I'm fiddling with the dialogue and I'm fiddling. It's a lot of fiddling. It's a lot of fiddling. You might also need to take time to do some brainstorming before you do this. If some of your notes were like, this doesn't work or this doesn't make sense, you might need to take some time to figure out, okay, well, how am I gonna make it make sense? And sometimes that can take a while. So give yourself time. It's not a rush. Brainstorm some stuff and figure out how to change things so that it will work. One of the things a lot of the videos that I linked below mention is that it's easier sometimes to do this in multiple passes through the whole manuscript. So some people go in and they'll do a pass where they're just focused on plot issues. Then they'll go in and they'll do a pass where they're just focused on character issues. Then they'll go in and they'll do a pass that's focused on like fixing the dialogue or the description or like little more prose level kind of things, where you're starting with the big picture stuff and then drilling down to smaller pieces. I think that's excellent advice. I can't do that. I tried last year. That was my plan last year. Was, okay, we're going to do plot first and then characters and then blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I could not do it that way. To me, everything is so interconnected, especially when it comes to plot and character. It was so much more work to try to separate it out than to just do it all together. I don't understand how that works. So absolutely separate things out. If you can figure that out and it works for you, that's awesome. If you can't figure it out like me, then just do everything all at once. So in terms of drafts, like what is a draft? Here's how my drafts ended up last year. Draft 1, of course, is just the original first draft. It's messy, it's clunky, we love it. She needs a lot of work though. Draft 2 for me is the revision after I've made all of the changes that I know need to be made. I send draft 2 to my critique partners, I get their feedback on it, and then I incorporate their feedback into the manuscript, and that produces a draft 3. Last year what I did is I then sent draft 3 back to the critique partners. They were real troopers, reading my work like 25 times. But I sent it back to them in acts this time. I usually just send it one chapter at a time when they're getting draft 2. For draft 3, I didn't necessarily need them to go in and be quite as nitpicky. I wanted more of like an overall sense of like, does this flow? Is the pacing okay? How do the characters read to you? That kind of thing. So for draft 3, I sent it to them in acts, and they added more comments, more feedback. I used that feedback on draft 3 to then produce a draft 4. Draft 4 is what I sent to my beta readers. My beta readers read it. They gave me more feedback, and I used their feedback to turn it into a draft 5. Draft 5.5 maybe? Draft 5 is really what I'm querying. So that's the general overview of how I have gone about revising my own projects. So now let's take a look at yours. My first recommendation, if you're sitting there with a first draft and you don't really know what to do with it, my first recommendation is to make sure that there is some kind of organization going on. I know some people don't like to organize stuff, and if this doesn't work for you, that's totally fine. But I say organize it purely for practical reasons. Let me show you how I have mine organized and why this might be beneficial for you. So this is actually going to cover 2 of the questions I got from some other viewers. One asked, do you do all of this in Scrivener or on paper? I'd like to see some tools in Scrivener for revision, so I'm going to show you that. And then also, when you take out portions of your writing because they no longer fit the story you're writing, do you completely discard it or save it for a potential story in the future? So, good questions. I think I'm going to try to cover both of those in this little section here. I've got my Scrivener file all pulled up here, and this is how I like to have things set up. I've got my scenes all broken out over here into little sections. You can scroll through it really easily, find what you need. On this side of the split screen, I've got my outline. I have all of the yellow stuff is going to be added. Struck through things are going to be deleted. And then in this inspector tool, which you can open and close with that little blue button, this is where I have all of my revision notes. Some of this is really simple stuff like, hey, make sure you describe the characters. What does the drawing room look like? Nobody knows. Clarifying what is meant by certain things, characters to add, seeds to plant for later, that kind of stuff. So all my things are listed right here. So yes, I do absolutely everything in Scrivener. I don't like using paper. I think paper can be good if you're stuck on something. I know a lot of people pull out a notebook and start writing, just sort of stream of consciousness style. And that can actually be really helpful for sciencey reasons. There's different synapses that happen in your brain when you use a pen and paper. So that can very much help make connections in your brain. So definitely try that if that works for you. I don't tend to do that. I don't know. It takes too long and I'm just like, bleh. I type it out and usually I'm good with that. Everything I do is in Scrivener. Now, in terms of the organizing over here, I've got my draft 1 all down here. This is all draft 1 right here. And what I did is I didn't delete a single thing out of this. I copied this whole folder, all of these scenes I copied, and that is draft 2. Then I'm changing it in here. So all of my original draft 1 stuff is in that draft 1 folder still. I never delete anything. Now, have I ever actually gone back and like reused something from an older draft or another project? No. But maybe. So I don't want to delete anything. I'm too scared to actually delete something. But I also have never actually ever had to go back to it for any reason. So that's just me. The rest of my Scrivener document has all of my various story notes, my revision notes. Here's all the stuff where I was like, I don't know, maybe do this. I had to think of some kind of new ending because I didn't like the ending. A lot of questions, a lot of this could happen or maybe this could happen. All the way back to like my very original idea for the story and things like that. I've got a huge section here of historical notes. This is mostly just cut and paste pictures from the internet, links to various things that I need to know for history things. I've got all my character details over here, details on the individual main characters, side characters, timeline for the entire series, because obviously we need that. I also have some notes from craft books in here, just in case I want that reference. So that's how I have mine set up. It's not the most fancy setup, probably. There's a ton of tools in Scrivener that I've never even touched. I don't use very many of the fancy tools, so it's pretty basic, but it works for me. I know Word and Google Docs have the ability to put like bookmarks or other separators where you can click through and it's easy to jump around within your manuscript. I would highly recommend doing that. Even if yours isn't divided into like easy chapters or scenes quite yet, you can at least put like a blur, a little bookmark where it's like, okay, this is the car chase scene. Okay, this is the first kiss scene. Okay, this is the part where they find out this piece of information about the mystery or whatever. Like, do something so that you can kind of click around a little easier and you're not scrolling through like 200 some pages. I know some writers really enjoy printing out the entire manuscript and putting it in a binder and using like page flags and sticky notes and all that kind of stuff. That's great. You can absolutely do that too if that helps you. I personally don't like that. The flipping through the, all of the pages gets overwhelming to me. I usually can't write fast enough to get my thoughts down the right way. I don't know. It doesn't work for me, but I do know that works for a lot of people. So once you've kind of got your document organized in some fashion, I would recommend, don't be mad at me if you're a pantser, but I would recommend creating or having some sort of outline. You don't have to, but if you're feeling overwhelmed, this could be something to try. So if you have absolutely no outline or your outline is really vague, I would suggest going in and just typing out like a summary of the story as it currently stands in your first draft. Even if you know, oh, I need to change this thing or this ending or whatever, type it out exactly as you have it currently, a summary. It doesn't have to sound pretty. We're not sending this to anyone. It's just so that you have a quick look at your story. First this happens, then this happens, and the character does this because of that, and then the character does that because of this, whatever. Just something really quick so you have the whole thing on like maybe 10 pages instead of 250 to 300 to 500 pages. Like, it's so much easier to look at a shortened version than this huge manuscript. Then you can use that outline to strike through things that need to be cut or put in new text and highlight it to show things that need to be added. It's so much easier, to me at least, to manipulate an outline, to change an outline, than it is to change a 5,000 word scene or a 60,000 word document. Like, that's just overwhelming. So start with the outline stuff first. Change that, and then you can use that to change the bigger manuscript. So let's head back to the note-taking and the figure out what is wrong. What is wrong with this manuscript. I'm going to share some things that I've absolutely found in my own work. I've also beta and alpha read for and critique partner read for several other writers at this point, and I've seen this kind of thing in their work too. So I don't know. I mean, I would say these are probably common things that a lot of writers encounter. So here's what they are, and here's what you can maybe do to fix them. I'm going to start with plot-related issues and then go to character-related issues. So for plot-related issues, one thing that a lot of writers do, and that again, I've definitely done this myself, is they start the story way too early. We have, 5 chapters of world building and setup and introducing characters and telling us about the history of the characters or their world or whatever. We do not need that. We don't need that. You might need it as a writer to kind of get yourself into the story and figure out exactly what your characters are supposed to be doing and figure out the rules of your world if you're like writing a fantasy or something. That's fine if you've got that, but readers don't need it. Look at the opening, 3, 5, 10, maybe even chapters of your book to figure out what actually do I need from this. Figure out where is your inciting incident. Generally speaking, this is flexible, obviously, but generally speaking, your inciting incident should be hitting in the first 10% of your book. So figure out what is your inciting incident and figure out where it's hitting. Is it hitting at word 5,000 of 50,000? You're probably doing pretty okay. Is it hitting at word 20,000 of 50,000? That's a little late. That's a little late. If you find that it is hitting kind of late in the story, it probably means you've got way too much setup kind of stuff that can be either condensed, incorporated later on, or otherwise gotten rid of. For example, The Hunger Games. The inciting incident happens right at the end of chapter 1, when Katniss's sister is chosen for the Hunger Games and Katniss does her volunteers tribute thing, right? That launches us into the rest of the story. And it happens pretty fast, end of chapter 1. One other issue you might find within your plot is that the plot is too episodic. And what I mean by this is that you have maybe some really interesting stuff happening, some really fun stuff happening, but the events are not really connected to each other than maybe it's the same characters or it's happening in the same place. Each scene should lead directly into the next one like dominoes, okay? Something should happen at the end of each scene that pushes us into the next one. If you can take a scene out of a story and there's no effect on the things around it, you either didn't need that scene at all or you haven't connected it properly to the scenes surrounding it. Same thing if you can like rearrange scenes and it really doesn't make a whole big difference. You've probably got some episodicness going, is that a word? Episodicness going on in your story. I think this is particularly something you might find between the 25 and 50% mark in your book, which is usually Act 2. This is part of like the fun and games section if you're following Save the Cat. It can be really easy to have lots of cool stuff going on and it could be like lots of action, but if it's not directly connected, it's not gonna flow quite right. A good test to use to see if you can link your scenes is to use the phrase "because of that" in between. So in scene 1, Katniss's beloved sister is chosen for the Hunger Games, and because of that, Katniss volunteers as tribute, and because of that, she is sent to the Capitol, and because of that, she meets different people, blah, 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 right? It's all linked. It's all linked perfectly. Your scenes should be able to link like that too. One other thing that for me is always super difficult is the ending. The ending can feel rushed. It can feel too easy, not earned. The characters like haven't earned the ending. It can feel convenient, or you maybe have like plot threads that have been kind of left open and unresolved. Endings are tough, I think, and you might need to rewrite the ending multiple times. I know there's some writers who are like, I don't start a first draft until I've figured out the ending. That's nice. I can't do that. I don't know like how. I don't get it. I always have an ending in mind when I start a first draft, but it almost always changes. Sometimes very dramatically. If your ending is feeling too convenient, it's where things are like magically working out so the protagonist can win. Like, you don't want that. You need to be clever and you need to think of how can the main problem be solved in a way that is interesting and unique and that isn't too easy. You also want to look at your subplots, make sure all that kind of stuff is resolved. The only exception I would say to this is if your book is part of a series. Your main conflict should be wrapped up at the end of book 1 or book whatever, but you might have little threads left open that will then lead into the next book or whatever's happening next. So for example, in the first Star Wars movie, they destroy the Death Star and it's like, yay, we did it, and they're all like happy. But the big bad guy, Darth Vader, he's like dispensed with. Remember, he goes like spinning through space or whatever. He's like out of the way, but he's not dead. And he's not completely powerless. So they've left that open, which then of course they use in the next movie to continue the story. But the big thing with the Death Star, we took care of that at least, right? So you can leave open things if you're continuing some kind of series. The other big plot issue that you might have is info dumps. We all love an info, no we don't. Nobody loves an info dump. Nobody wants the history of your fantasy world. Nobody wants to know like all of the details of your character's childhood. We do not need to know the details of the Corn Laws that were passed in England in 1815. If there are details of those things that are important, you have to layer them in across multiple scenes. Otherwise, your book is going to be a snooze fest. So ask yourself, what information does a reader need right now? Right in chapter 1, what do they absolutely have to know to make the story make sense? Only give the reader that information. Then in scene 2, what do they have to know to make this make sense? Give them that information there. Be persnickety with those pieces of information. There's also the element of show don't tell. It's so much more interesting to see magic being used rather than somebody telling somebody else how they could use their magic. Or for example, like in the kind of stories I'm writing, if I'm writing about the Corn Laws, which I'm not, but I did research them heavily, I could have a character giving some sort of speech about the Corn Laws. That's really boring. No one wants to read that. Or I could have him going into the street and seeing how people are being charged a ton of money for bread and how they can't afford it anymore. And that's because of these stupid Corn Laws, right? Like, that's a lot more compelling if you see people suffering because of something. Now, okay, now we need to know a little more about these laws. Like, how can we fix this, right? Okay, so then, show it. Don't tell it. One other final plot thing that could be an issue is a lack of tension or a lack of urgency. Your characters might have like some really cool goals, or the story could be set up in a really fun kind of way, but if they're just like, well, they're working on it. They'll get there. They're working on it, but they're kind of like lackadaisical. There's no real sense of urgency or rush to it. That can make the pacing feel kind of slow. One really easy way to resolve that for yourself is to add a ticking time bomb element or some sort of deadline. If the characters don't get the goal or win the thing by X date or this time, then there's this huge consequence. Add that sort of thing, and now all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we've got to do this right now, and if we don't, then everything's going to explode or whatever. So see if you can add a time element to it. That can really help with tension. Now let's move on to characters, and like I said before, I have a really hard time separating plot and character because they are so interwoven. So some of this is kind of going to be plot stuff too, but I put it in characters because one character issue you might run into is that your character feels really flat. They feel kind of boring, uninteresting. They're very one-dimensional. They might resemble too closely a popular character from other books, movies, TV shows, that kind of thing. So if you find that's a problem, you might want to take some time to do a little bit of a deep dive into who your character is, what makes them unique. You want to make sure they have a really clearly defined want, need, goal, motivation, all that good stuff, emotional wounds, what lie do they believe, what are their flaws, what are their strengths, all that kind of stuff you should have nailed down pretty solidly. I'm going to recommend the character profile questionnaire. If you've been around my channel for a while, I've mentioned this stupid questionnaire so many times. You guys are probably sick of it. I'm sorry, but I love it. I love it. It's at the end of the Positive Trait Thesaurus, and it's also available free. It's a free online download. You can grab it. I'll link it below. But the questions in this little questionnaire, character profile kind of thing, there's a ton of those on the internet you can find. A lot of them tend to be really surface level. What is your character's favorite color? If your character was stranded on a desert island, what movie would they want to bring with them? Like, okay, it's not bad to answer those questions, but they're pretty surface level. The questions in this questionnaire, I feel like, get really deep. And for me, at least, if I go through and answer the questions for my characters, it really helps me get a pretty solid grasp on who they are. I would also highly recommend checking out Creating Character Arcs by K.M. Weiland and The Emotional Craft of Writing by Donald Mass. These are excellent. I really would highly recommend the Donald Mass book. It's fantastic, and it gives you a lot of insight into character creation. So definitely check those out if you haven't already. Again, I'll link those below as well. Another problem you might encounter with your characters is that your main character might feel kind of passive. The story is happening to them, and they're not really being the one to drive things forward. Your main character should, in most scenes, be the person driving the story forward. So ask yourself, what decision is my character making in this scene? How is that propelling the story to move forward? Now, every now and then you might have like the antagonist launch a surprise attack, and like, that's fine. But then what is the character doing in response? Are they just cowering in the corner, or what is their plan to like get back at them or rescue themselves, or whatever needs to be done? What decision is your character making in each scene? See if that will help in terms of making your character more active rather than passive. Another thing, these next couple ones I struggled with so hard in my early writing projects. Like, I don't know why. This is in like every craft book, I feel like, and I just didn't get it exactly. So here they are. You might find that your character has a lack of goals or motivation. Now, I think when I was reading craft books, I assumed they were talking about like an overall goal. Like, what does the character want on a high story level? Do they want to find love? Do they want to find security? Do they want to, win back the kingdom's throne because they've been kicked out by the evil king or something like that? Like, that's like their big overarching goal. But your character also needs a goal in every single scene. It's not just this one big goal, it's all the little goals in between. Every scene, your character should be trying to get something. If they don't want something in every scene, it might make your story feel a little directionless, a little meandering. So if your story kind of feels like it's going off on these little tangents and just sort of all over the place, it might be because your character lacks a goal in every scene. So go through each scene and try to identify, what is my character trying to achieve in this scene? And it doesn't have to always be like they're trying to win the big battle against the evil king. It could be just something like they need to convince this other character to join their team to go off to battle or something like that. Like, it doesn't have to be some, huge thing every single time. Sometimes it's a quieter kind of goal, but they still should have some kind of goal. And they should have a plan for how they're going to try to get that goal. And that leads right into the next thing that, again, I have struggled with so hefty, and that is weak or non-existent conflict. Again, I was thinking like overarching conflict. Well, yeah, they're trying to get back the kingdom. Obviously, they're going to have like the king or the big bad guy to fight or whatever. That's fine. But you also need conflict on a scene level. Every single scene should have a conflict that your main character has to face. Your character has this goal, they have this thing they're trying to achieve, right? And there's going to be something in their way. What is preventing them from getting the goal? That's the conflict. There should be something in every scene preventing them from achieving what they want to achieve. That's what makes the story interesting. So evaluate each scene or each chapter and ask yourself, what is the conflict here? What obstacle is my character coming up against when they're trying to achieve their goal? So if you're planning a heist story of some sort and your character is going to steal the diamond or the statue or whatever from the museum, and they just walk in and they grab it and they leave, that's pretty boring. We want to see them like figuring out how to elude the guards and override the security system and all that kind of stuff, right? That's what makes it fun. If you want a great example of how this can be done, Ocean's 11, I think, is a great choice to watch. There is fast-paced action, tons of conflict throughout the entire movie right up until the final scene. One thing that could help if you're struggling to figure out, well, like, what is the conflict here? Ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could happen to this character right now? And then do that. Do that worst thing. Related also to conflict is low or no stakes. This is, again, something that I struggled a lot with, and this one is also still sometimes pretty tricky. Like, what do they stand to lose or gain? Conflict is nothing if there's no stakes involved. The stakes tell us what the consequence is if the character wins or loses. So in Ocean's 11, for example, the characters are trying to rob a Las Vegas casino. If they fail, if any one of this giant team of them fail, they're all going to go to jail. Not good. If they succeed, however, then they're walking away with like $1 million for each of them or whatever it was. They're walking away with a lot of money. Okay, those are some pretty high stakes. So in every scene, try to lay out your character's goal, the motivation. Why do they want that thing? Why do they care so much? the conflict, the stakes. Those are really important on a scene-by-scene level. The final thing that you might find in terms of characters is you might have too many characters. If your friend has like 7 best friends, like do they really need that many best friends? They could maybe have like 2. So if you've got a ton of side characters, see if there is a way to combine some of them into just one character. That will make it so much easier for you as the writer, and it'll be a lot less confusing for readers to try to differentiate, 7 different side people. I did ask in a couple different places whether anyone had questions about revision. I did get some, so let's go over those real quick. So the first question here is about overthinking. How do you deal with overthinking during the revision process? When do you know when it's happening, and how do you combat it? I definitely overthink things quite a bit, but one thing that helps me is I know that especially in these early revision passes, it's not going to be perfect. I'm not trying to make the story perfect. I'm just trying to make it a little bit better. Each draft, the story improves a little bit at a time. So I don't need it to be perfect. I don't need to overthink it too badly in those first stages. I'm just aiming for better, not perfect. The other thing I would highly recommend if you're worried, like trying to think like, do I do this? Do I do that? Do I do this other thing? And you can't make a decision. If at all possible, find a critique partner, find another writer that you can bounce ideas off of. I can't tell you how much my writing has improved and how helpful critique partners have been for me. I have the critique partner matchup. I'll link it below. If you don't have a critique partner, there's a bunch of people in that list at this point. I think like 60 plus people. So check that out if you haven't yet. Yeah, a critique partner can be great in saying, ooh, definitely do not do that. That sounds terrible. Like, do this other thing over here. The next question was, how do you go about developing settings and knowing which setting to use for which scene? I thought this was interesting. I don't know if I've ever really like hardcore thought about where do I set something. I think because right now I'm, writing Regency romance, and so it's pretty narrowed down in terms of setting. I'm writing about aristocrats and lords and ladies. So the country is usually pretty set. I mean, they're going to be like in England, maybe Wales or Scotland, but so far I've just been writing in England. And then in terms of setting, like there's generally places where people of that class would be found. They might be at a townhouse in London. They might be at a country estate. There were other places around London that they might have gone, like Almack's or Vauxhall Gardens or Covent Gardens or something like that. You're not going to find a highfalutin lady out in like the farm fields with the farmers, probably. I mean, maybe, but your plot is going to have to set that up pretty well. They're not going to be out by themselves in some dangerous part of town. So like, I'm kind of limited with where they're going to be. That does pose the problem of making sure your settings are varied enough so that it's still interesting. I have one problem in my current project that I know needs to be fixed. I'm not worried about it for this current draft that I'm working on, but I have 2 scenes pretty close together that are structured very similarly, and they take place in the same place, the same room in the house. So in the first scene, the heroine is working in like a library, and the hero comes home. They have a conversation and it ends in like an argument. Then literally like 2 scenes later, the heroine is in the library. She's working on some stuff. The hero comes home. They have a conversation. It does end differently. They end in sort of like a little bit more of a truce, but it's very similar. And so I need to find a way to vary that. Changing the setting could help. That's one thing I definitely need to fix in my current project. The second question here was, if you don't have an outline, where do you recommend to start? Is rereading and making an outline as you revise a good idea? Yes, I think I covered that earlier. At least try to make an outline. I just feel like that makes it so much easier to navigate and to plan out how you're going to revise the project. I got 2 questions over on Instagram. The first one was, how do you make it fun when you don't like revising? That's a tough one. I don't know if I try to make it fun, honestly. I have grown to like revision a little more in the last like year and a half or so, because I feel like I know a little better what I'm doing. But really my big motivation is the story itself. I love the story, or at least like what it is in my head, and I want to try to make the words on the page sort of fit what's going on in my head for it. I want it to be published. I want it to get into the hands of readers. And so even though the revision process isn't like super fun, I'm motivated to push through it and get the work done so I can get to that later stage of publication. And finally, how long does it take? This is going to vary from writer to writer, of course, but I'll just give you the example of my draft from last year, how long that took me. So August 2022 is when I started outlining the project. I worked on that all the way through the end of October. November into the first week of December, I drafted. Then I set it aside for about 3 weeks. I picked it up again in January of 2023 and I started working on a draft 2. That took me about 3.5 months. Draft 3 took less time. I was finished with that by the end of May. That was like a month and a half or so. Draft 4 was even shorter. I finished that at the end of June. That was about a month. My beta readers got the book in July and then kind of trickled into August a little bit. So while they had it, I wasn't really working on it at all. It was off being read by other people and getting feedback from them. Once I received all the feedback by mid-August, I had 6 weeks. I gave myself 6 weeks to revise it into a draft 5, and I did finish that by the end of September. I worked on other projects in October and November, and then in December I did nothing. I was resting because I like just resting in December. But the book was pretty much done at the end of September, and then in January I was polishing up my query letter and synopsis and all that kind of stuff, getting my list of agents ready, and I started querying by mid-January. So all in all, the actual revision part took about 9 months for me. So I hope that was helpful. Give yourself grace when you're working on revisions. It's not easy. It feels very clunky a lot of the time. It can feel like you're floundering around and not just sort of like flailing helplessly on the floor. It's okay. Take your time, especially if you're a new writer. This is not easy. So just give yourself grace, give yourself time to learn, and you will get there if you keep trying. I'm sure there's more things I could cover here. If I think of more stuff, I might do a part 2, or if you guys have other questions, want clarification on something, definitely let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, you can click the subscribe button. I post videos on Fridays. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.